Pawb, good morning. We will make start in just a minute. We love to hear the pings of people joining, and we'll just give it another minute before we make start. Okay, we'll make a start. We have a lot to get through. We will, I'm sure, have more people joining as the session continues. So, Barada Croeso, good morning and welcome. Shiraki Gyd, how are you all? Edwina Dwi, dwi'n gweithio Canolfan Gwasanaethau Cyhoeddus Digidol. So I'm Edwina and I head up the communications and engagement team at the Centre for Digital Public Services. Our role, in a nutshell, is to support the public sector in Wales to design and deliver better public services based around the needs of those who use them. And part of that is about knowledge sharing, so highlighting good practice and also learnings. And our webinar series is very much one of the ways in which we do this. We're delighted to partner with the ONS for this webinar series, looking at the end-to-end journey for delivering the Digital First Census of 2021. Today's session is the second in a three-part series. More on that in a minute, but first I want to go through some just short housekeeping. So we've set this up as a Teams webinar, which means by default you should join on mute. I think most people are, as far as I can see. If this isn't the case, please do pop yourself on mute, and this is just to avoid any distractions for our presenters. It's a longer session than normal. We usually do our webinars in 60-minute slots. But as you can imagine, and I said this in the first webinar series, trying to cover something as complex as the census that's 10 years in the making is really hard to do. So after the first presentation, we will take a short 5-minute comfort break before coming back to the second half of the webinar, and we do aim to finish at 11 o'clock. The session will be recorded, so if you do have to duck out at any time, or if you think that the session would be of interest to colleagues post-event, then the link will be shared with you, and the slide decks will also be shared to circulate. Llínos is live tweeting the session for us today. Diolch Llínos. So this thread will be a really useful quick summary looking back on the session as well. So please do pop over to Twitter. You'll find us at @CDPS_Cymru. If you have any questions, pop them in the questions and answers box, which is at the top of your screen. You can do that as we go along, or you can save them up and type furiously at the end. We've allocated plenty of time for questions, and we aim to cover as many as possible. If you'd like to contribute on Gymraeg, we have Allo on hand to translate as well, and I see Allo has popped that into the chat. We'll also be asking for your feedback at the end of the session, and this is really important for us. We're not going to send out a feedback form post-event because we know best will in the world, people are busy, and return rates for those are usually quite low. So we're going to do some in-session feedback using something called Menti. If you've not used Menti before, you just need to open a separate tab or scan a QR code, which we will pop on screen. And the address that we need you to pop in, if you are opening a separate tab, is menti, menti.com, and enter code 38063864. But we'll come back to that, and Alan will pop it in the chat as well, so you have it there for reference. So what are we going to cover today, and what have we covered so far? Last week, as I said, this is a series. Last week was the first one. This is the second one. So the team talked last week all about the design and the build of the 2021 census, and we got a real insight into the benefits of a digital first approach. And this included things like content and the words that were used, but the ability to change and add extra instruction. There was also a consideration for the Welsh language and for accessibility, and the team covered that in the webinar last week. They also looked at how they used existing components in the bill, such as address lookup, and they ran through the full end-to-end journey and all of the digital products that had to work together to ensure a smooth user experience. The session was recorded, so as I say, if you didn't get a chance to tune into that last week, we will circulate that along with the link to this one as well. So that was last week. Today we're moving on to look at the collection and the processing of this census data. And we have Rob Doherty, who's collection and addressing lead, and Pete Large, who's head of census statistical design, with us. So we're going to hear from Rob first. And as I said, we'll take a short 5-minute break after Rob's presentation. So Rob, without any further ado, I'll hand over to you. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch, Edwina, and bore da, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again today. Thank you to those of you who were able to attend the first session. And I think with what we're intending to do with this one is to build on that, but even if you weren't able to, hopefully this gives some window into how we approached turning the design that we had in order to create high quality statistics into an operational approach and a way of designing the collection operation to maximize the quality of the census data that we collected. So as Edwina has said, introducing me, my name's Rob Doherty. I'm the collection and addressing lead for Census Statistical Design. The first thing that I just want to say, sort of as a little bit of a kind of caveat or almost apology for this session is, as Edwina says, the census itself is incredibly complex. There are many different topics that we could spend a full hour and a half discussing the minutiae of, and run this for the best part of a year. But what I'm trying to give today, and what we're trying to give today, is just an overview of some of the key parts of what went into running what was ostensibly our first digital first census. And so I've included links here, and I'll refer to some of these publications, maybe along with other publications. And what I would encourage you to do is, if there is anything of interest or anything that you want to know more about that I touch on, albeit kind of briefly within this session, I would suggest that you check out those links, because we have tried to be as transparent as possible to give as much of a window onto the approach that we've taken, and so therefore we have published quite a lot on the website. I think, as I said in the previous session, can be a little bit tricky to navigate at times, but yeah, I provided some links here. And I also, in the first session, I put up this diagram, so I'm going to do it again. I promise that the rest of the slides won't just be recycled from my introduction to the previous one. But just to say, what does a digital first census, or what did it mean from a collection perspective for the user experience, and for how we kind of approach the exercise? I think the thing to say is that the plan for Census 2021 was always to maximise the number of people who can complete without support in the way that they wish. So it was giving people the option to complete online if that was the way that they wished to. It was also, we designed the operation to remind people most effectively, and I can speak a little bit about how our approach potentially changed as we went in from the initial collection phase into kind of the reminder phase. And also the approach was intended to provide extra support to those who needed it during live operations. It's worth saying that in 2011 we did have an online collection element, and around 16.4% of households completed online. But we did massively expand that sort of this time around. The online first principle that guided the design and the development of the statistical operational systems and processes was kind of key to kind of everything that we did. But routes to provide paper questionnaires and other mechanisms to support people where needed were provided as well. So what were the aims then of providing or conducting a digital first census? So the 4 key aims when the decision in 2014 was made to run a digital first census were to Improved data quality, which is something Pete will speak more on today, because of the potential that you're given when you complete online for validation checks, search as you type, functionality, and it also meant from us that we had a reduced reliance on error-prone scanning or handwritten responses, easing the respondent burden as well. And this was something that again was kind of built into the way that we kind of offer routing through the questions. The opportunity for people to complete anywhere on any device was what we aimed for. As I said, the search as you type functionality, providing people with unique access codes instantaneously as well, rather than needing to send things out to them, and also individual access codes for private or separate responses to households, particularly as there was some sensitive questionnaire content that we included this time around. But what it also meant as well for us was that the timeliness of the response and enabled us to process the data faster. So we were receiving data as soon as the online questionnaires were submitted. We were monitoring progress throughout our field operation and using our resources more efficiently. And then on the back end, which I'll say a little bit about as well, on processing, that came with some advantages as well in terms of the tuning and the efficiency of the way that we were able to process the data. But also as well within that, there was obviously a consideration towards reducing costs, but also the environmental impact of running a census if you have so much kind of paper resource. So for each household, initial contact letters in place of a paper questionnaire eliminated 15 pieces of paper from what it would have been in 2011. Fewer reminder letters, envelopes, or additional costs associated with that. And obviously as well, that helps to reduce our environmental impact. So from a collection perspective, there were several reasons for taking this approach but it was all geared towards meeting the most critical quality targets for census collection. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what we wanted as many people to respond as possible. So our national response rate that we set ourselves as a quality target across England and Wales was 94%. But even more important than this was to ensure that we got a consistent response across all local authorities, which was inherent to the design that we have for producing statistical estimates. So we had a minimum response target of 80% across all local authorities. And within that, even we looked to minimize the variability of response as much as possible. So during collection, we were monitoring how close response rates in smaller areas, so across lower layer super output areas, and I'll say a little bit about what those are, making sure that those response rates were as close as possible to the overall average for the local authority that they were in, but also how close they were to the average for similar areas as well. And given the benefits we aim to derive from an online approach, but still appreciating that some respondents would want to still complete via paper completion, which was an important component, we set a quality target of 75% of all households to respond online. So this next diagram, and apologies that it isn't translated, I won't touch on kind of everything that went into this. I'll sort of just say very briefly that the approach we took to designing the collection operation came through a combination of practical rehearsal, both through a test that we conducted in 2017, and then the larger 2019 census rehearsal on a wider scale. So that practical experience of running a pilot operation. Also from internal assurance processes through various assurance groups and governance structures that we had, but also importantly as well through independent academic peer review, through what was called the Methodological Assurance Research Panel, or MARP. And I'll say a little bit about MARP papers, and I have put a link in there. But in terms of the detail as to how this design all came together, I would encourage you to look through those. And I'll just briefly say that, so the simulation modelling used measures and assumptions, including the willingness of respondents to self-respond and the propensity to respond or switch to responding on paper questionnaires. So this is what we term and what I'll speak about in terms of our hard to count indices that we developed. It was also, the modelling was based on the effectiveness of reminder letters, again through testing and also through assumptions, and the contact and effectiveness rate of field staff and field visit durations to plan that size of field force and what we would need in order to be able to mop up non-respondents. And to model variations of the collection operation, so we tested and evaluated different waves of contact, paper and reminder strategies, and estimated the resources needed under each to achieve the key quality targets that I set out. And so this helped to determine the final field numbers and produce the expected response profiles at local areas against which live returns could be measured and tracked. Also, as well, it's worth saying that we put some contingencies in there under different COVID impact scenarios. Again, I can't sort of say too much on the specifics of that myself, but we have published on what our COVID response was and what the impact on the design was. So just moving on to focus on the hard to count indices, core part of our design and the way that the approach we took towards encouraging response through both online and paper completions was set out were the hard to count indices. So 2 domains went into this, which was the willingness index. So the hard to count willingness index was the likelihood of response without a field visit or reminder, and that was based on the 2011 hard to count index. So our experience from running the previous census and having that national picture, but also the hard to count digital index as well, which was what we felt modelling using DVLA and Ofcom data and other sources were the propensity of people within local areas to respond online. So how likely it was that we were going to get high response. So each index classified local areas, so lower super output areas. There's around 35,000 of those in England. There's around 33,000 of those in England and around 2,000 or so in Wales. They're usually including approximately 650 households in them as kind of relatively standardized units. And in terms of the population that they include, it's usually around 1,500 people. So we classified those with a score between 1 and 5. So 1 being the most likely in each category, either to be willing or to respond online, and then 5 being the least category. And that index, were the proportions within each was sort of shown as is kind of seen on the diagram there. And that then informed what we did as far as an online or paper strategy. So using the hard to count indices, we developed 3 distinct contact strategies, as is shown by the coloured cells on this table. So those in white, the LSOAs that we determined it would be easiest to get a response from and that we judged were more likely to respond online were treated as digital by default. That's that we sent them a unique access code in their initial contact letter and follow-up rather than a paper questionnaire. And that was roughly 78% of all LSOAs across England and Wales that were treated in this way. There were then the LSOAs which are covered in the blue cells, those that we determined it would be harder to get a response from, who were initially sent an online access code, but in subsequent follow-up were provided a paper questionnaire to respond. So were basically given both means through which they could provide as a response. And finally, there's the cells that are shaded in yellow, which represent the LSOAs that will receive a paper questionnaire first, as we estimated that they'd be willing to respond, but maybe less likely to do so online. So in all, around 89% of all LSOAs we treated as online first when we're kind of creating that distinction. So that's the white and the blue cells within this table here, and around 11% then received paper questionnaires with their initial contact. The proportions for Wales are substantially higher than that 11%, but I'll talk about that, sort of move on to that in a sec. Apologies that this is a bit small and I put it in the last minute, but this just maps out the contact strategy before and after Census Day, which again I think has been published in a marked paper if you're interested in the details, so I won't dwell on this because I appreciate it's quite small to see, but the red boxes here relate to material sent to respondents. And this then, depending on the route, would either be a letter with a unique access code inviting them to fill in their census form online, or it would be a paper questionnaire that we would send as part of that contact at that point. So be either as a first contact or a reminder that we do so, depending on their LSOA, as I said, within the hard to count matrix. But respondents, however, could also obtain questionnaires, a paper questionnaire, through calling the dedicated Census contact centre or through the respondent home website that we offered, which was the portal for respondents to complete online or to engage with us online. If they were able to find their address within the lookup there, they could also provide a paper questionnaire to them. So again, it's about not the digital by default, or is also about kind of offering opportunities for respondents still to be able to complete on paper if they wish to do so. So alongside those 4 key routes of the first contact, the reminder, the contact centre or respondent home, there are also other additional targeted support that we provided. So paper questionnaires were available from census officers who were doing response chase up and following up on the doorstep. We also offered and had very limited telephone capture for those who might have had difficulty completing online or on paper. There was then the option that we could conduct a telephone interview, but that was a relatively or very small sort of proportion of responses. And we also had census support centres in the community for those who wish to complete the census online, but might need assistance to do so. It's important to emphasise that we wanted to promote and offer online completion even for those households that we sent the paper questionnaire to or received a paper questionnaire, per the principle of our design of allowing respondents to respond in the way that they wished. And therefore, there were unique access codes to complete online, prominently printed in the box that's circled on red in the example of the front page of a paper questionnaire form I provided here, which, if they entered that unique access code via the Census web portal, so Respondent Home, would allow the respondent to complete the census form for their household online, and that would then be linked to their address as well. So we would be able to log the household from which that response was received. So I'll also just very briefly touch on I-forms, so individual forms. So as I've said, there was a potential issue with a single unique access code or a single paper questionnaire being sent to a whole household. We were asking sensitive questions that some people might not be comfortable sharing or disclosing potentially to others in the household. Sensitivity around some of the questions such as sexual orientation or gender identity questions, for example. So what we offered was and promoted on what we sent through was the opportunity for private unique access codes or individual paper questionnaires to be available on request by telephone, online or field force for those who didn't want to fill in on the main form. And then those were prioritized when it came to resolving when we might have multiple responses where someone might have responded also on their behalf, built into the design. And we had around 226,000 individual responses that we received, and 96.5% of those were received online. We published these figures, so I won't dwell on them too much, but the outcome of our encouragement of the online approach was pretty positive in relation to the targets that we set ourselves. So the vast majority in online areas responded online, and in some areas that was as much as 100% online response. Even in paper first areas, we were still seeing almost half of our household responses being online responses. But here, what I'll say, just I think on the top line here, we've got the breakdown in terms of the percentage of LSOAs that were deemed to be paper first. In Wales, actually half of the LSOAs were deemed to be paper first areas. And this again was informed by the data that we had that went into the hard to count indices and from the testing that we'd done in advance. So it's quite a lot higher than the 9% of all LSOAs in England that were paper first. But all I'd say on that is generally in Wales, we saw a slightly lower online response share compared to England for both online first and paper first LSOAs. So the evidence kind of that we got from the census was that approach was kind of broadly a sound approach to take. And so 88.9% of households overall provide at least some form of online return. As I mentioned at the start, our target was 75%, so we've very much exceeded that. But what I'll say as well, oh, apologies, I put my note for this on the previous slide. So because we took this approach, we did ask the question of whether such a high online uptake meant we'd been overly cautious in our approach to offering paper questionnaires to 11% of LSOAs. And it presented an issue as well of we couldn't provide a national, regional or local authority picture for online demand because we'd taken two separate approaches to our contact strategy and we'd done so on a very small sort of area basis. So I'll just very briefly talk about something that we published, which is the Digital Propensity Index. So this is where we asked ourselves the question of what overall share could we have achieved if all our LSOAs were online first. And in order to look into this, we used a binomial logistic regression to model against multiple independent variables. And the variables that went into that regression are listed here, but we did also test several other independent variables, but found the ones that we've kind of included here were best for the creation of the model. So this then gave us a predicted online share of what we might have expected for an LSOA had it been treated as online first for where we treated an LSOA originally as paper first. So in a sense, it's a measure of how confident households might have been in using online services, and it potentially provides as an alternative to the hard to count digital index that we've used in the planning of Census 2021. So it's learning to a degree and modelling on the basis of what we got out of the census in terms of results. Again, this is all published and I provided a link in the slide. But when we do look at what the digital propensity indexes indicated for Wales, it does suggest we might have achieved an online share of response similar to what we saw in the English regions had we taken an overall online first approach. But the thing that I want to stress here is that within these figures, these are online shares of responses. They're not overall response rate figures. So it doesn't provide any indication of what the impact on overall response might have been if we'd have taken this approach. So another advantage from a collection design perspective of having online responses from respondents and being able to instantaneously receipt those was that helped us have a much more real-time picture when it came to the management information that we had in-house. And so I'll just say a little bit about how that assisted us. So effectively, what using a Google Cloud platform allowed us to do was every day, so in relative real time, read all the data in, not just from receipts of cases, but also the fieldwork progress and productivity as well, to have that big picture, but also as well an incredible kind of wealth and detail of data at our fingertips whilst we were managing the operation. So this allowed us through the proprietary product we use called Looker to feed various dashboards, but also to explore and query to investigate further any potential issues that we encountered. And it's worth stressing that in 2011, all field force workloads and outcomes were recorded on paper. So the 2021 digital approach meant field visits were electronically scheduled and targeted based on up-to-date response information, with field outcomes and effectiveness being monitored. So effectively, we had the means to be able to kind of target our resources, to send out any messages based upon anything that we observed, and also to look at kind of particular problem areas. So we built from the learnings from the census rehearsal in 2019 on this, where we used two primary dashboards, which was monitoring response, which is shown on the left, and also monitoring fieldwork performance, which is the dashboard on the right here. These were developed in Python, and what we were able to monitor and visualize remained pretty limited to these main indicators during the rehearsal, even though the scope and demand for more information grew. So building, I guess, on that learning of what was kind of effective with these dashboards, but also the need for kind of more bespoke information and more granular detail. We put together a dedicated team with a more all-encompassing scope, looking to bolt together and provide information from all the data sources being generated from Census. And the decision then was made to license the visualization software and Looker and plug this into the MI data store that we have from the Google Cloud platform. So core to the management and governance of this was still supplying key dashboard information to inform the operational governance that we had and to determine if any further action or measures in the field might be needed, or any risks needed to be escalated at that point. But also as well, I guess kind of the benefit of this for the online completion and having online completion, along with having the digital infrastructure behind it, was that we were able to get an immediate picture on how response was progressing. And in our case, and in terms of the way that the collection operation went, this helped to give the reassurance in what ultimately turned out to be a really positive picture. As I said, we kind of modeled estimates of what we expected to get, and we also monitored our return rates against those estimates, and found that throughout we kind of the picture of what we were expecting to get was broadly similar. The shape of those estimates actually looks kind of pretty good, but we did exceed our kind of expectations there. So our estimate would have been to have around 44% return rate following Census Day, but we'd actually achieved a 70% return rate at that point. And that was relatively consistent across all local authorities in England and Wales at that point. So having this real-time information kind of gave that reassurance. I'll very briefly just say as well, as I mentioned here, that what Looker provided us with was the functionality to be able to look at the high level on the dashboards, but also like very specifically as well, through the Explore look that we had, to look for things that maybe weren't apparent in the visualizations, or looking at what might have underpinned that. So even though our picture of response overall was very positive, being able to, and apologies, this is a little bit small, being able to focus in on potentially where on a very small area where we might be having problems with response, and being able to look into the reasons for that. Sometimes it was technical. So for example, I think in the east of England, we had a delay in receiving paper questionnaires, which actually turned out not to be an issue in terms of response, but did in terms of the data that was being fed in. We were able to kind of look into that, and also to kind of identify that issue and resolve it much quicker as a result. So yeah, so this gave us kind of very sort of granular detail on how we were doing and how we were progressing in various areas. So in all, the overall picture, and I won't say very much about response rates and what we actually achieved, because we've been very sort of front and center about that, and have published on it. in all 335 local authorities, I might be missing a couple there, we exceeded the 80% response target. And in 5 of those, we actually exceeded by the end of Census Day as well. The last authority to exceed 80% was Kensington and Chelsea, and that was on the 14th of April. 2 weeks before the end of field follow-up. So again, having this picture then gave us that reassurance, and touch wood, no major kind of remedial action was needed, just because of how things had kind of progressed. So it was very useful for us to have this kind of MI information. So in terms then of kind of summary as to what would be, I suppose, kind of the main takeaways or kind of lessons learned from running the collection in the way that we did, I think flexibility and accessibility in design ensured a positive outcome from collection. So obviously the online response that we received was incredibly positive, and exceeded our expectations, but having also as well the support that we provided through various means and the opportunity for people to complete paper questionnaires or their own individual forms, then sort of allowed us to be kind of accessible as possible and to hit those kind of overall targets that we had. In terms of what fed the design and the modeling, the assumptions, the testing that went into that, I'd say using the available data sources and lessons learned from those exercises to inform the design was a very key part of kind of the success that we saw. And I'd also say as well, in terms of monitoring the collection operation that we had, having that view of the big picture, but also using the opportunity for the digital infrastructure that we had to be able to investigate the small details, to be able to look at problems on an individual case level, as well as just on a national, regional or local authority level, was again sort of very important to the success of the collection operation. So Edwina, I will hand over to you now at this point, as I think before we move on, the intention is that we'll have a break.
Yeah, a quick 5-minute comfort break, so people could come back at 10:12 to be precise. Rob will be picking up again and then handing to Pete. Hopefully you've got a lot of questions. If you've got any and you want to pop them in the chat, do so now so the presenters can start thinking about responses. But if not, keep them until the end. I know I certainly have a couple noted down. So yeah, back here at 10:12, please go and grab a cuppa and have a quick comfort break. Thank you. Croeso nôl, welcome back. Just checking I have Rob back. I'll be handing to him in a second. I do indeed. Lovely. 5 minutes isn't very long, isn't it? But hopefully you did manage to grab a drink or a cuppa. Okay, as I said, we're into the second part of the webinar now, and we will aim to finish at 11 o'clock. So Rob, plenty to get through. Over to you. Thank you.
Diolch. Thank you, Edwina. So now I'm just going to very briefly touch on the data processing side of digital first census. I will say this is not my area of knowledge per se. I'm just going to make, I guess, some very brief points in here, and then I'll hand over to Pete because I've already spoken for long enough, to be honest. So I guess the first thing that I would say, or I guess sort of the main point to make, is to make the front end as usable and accessible for respondents as possible creates a lot of complexity on the back end, and that shouldn't necessarily be underestimated. But what it also does as well, by having the design that we had, by being digital first, by getting the data in real time, provided the opportunity for tuning and to kind of be more flexible in the processing design, to be able to deal with some of the unforeseen issues that we had, whether that was unforeseen because of the COVID pandemic, or whether that was because of the way that respondents were interacting with the products that we had. So those are the main takeaways. And then I'll just briefly, I guess, sort of say a little bit about what data processing for Census 2021 looked like, and how it utilized the digital infrastructure that we had, and the more possibility for more real-time processing. So just in comparison then, to say between 2011 and 2021, the time that we had to be able to start processing, our Census Go live date was on the 27th of March for that. We didn't start processing until the beginning of June because we were getting responses pretty much instantaneously. We were pretty much processing from Census Day itself. I think previously as well, we'd externally contracted it out. This time we were doing it in-house, which again gave us, I guess, more of that flexibility to respond where potentially the requirements changed as a result of what we were seeing. And it allowed as well for early performance tuning and configuration of the new ONS kind of technical platform and infrastructure. So what we were using was Cloudera, Stack, and PySpark within our internal environment, which was the Data Access Platform, or DAP. And yeah, early provision of high quality, cleaned and adjusted tuning data was then kind of fed to every downstream method or process well ahead of the time that it would have taken if we hadn't have taken the approach that we had. But then in terms of, because we were offering a mixed method approach in terms of both paper questionnaires and online completion, as far as the data capture, coding rules and consolidation goes, creates new challenges of taking those raw responses for every variable collected across multiple questionnaire types. And I'll say a little bit about how many that actually turned out to be. Coding them to be consistent and consolidating them into a consistent value range and structure presented certain challenges. So the inherent advantage that you have from collecting through an electronic questionnaire is that you don't get some of the raw paper questionnaire responses that you get of where you might have single tick codes, you might have multi-tick codes to single tick questions. You might get a tick, and then you also might have raw text, or you might just get kind of free text kind of included as well. And so in terms of some of the checks that were offered through EQ, that helped to consolidate that a bit, but it did sort of pose challenges there. And yeah, I think it was complicated a little bit by the complexity of the raw data. So we'd never had to build it in-house before, so there was a kind of learning curve there. The optimization of the user experience, as I say, was not necessarily conducive to a simple processing model. The number of forms was pretty vast, as I said, and how that then kind of looked on the initial consolidation side. So everything in the green and blue boxes here was about kind of standardizing and consolidating the data into a kind of single usable model. And the green blocks here are the questionnaire types. So in terms of the questionnaires that we had, across the electronic questionnaires, we had the household, the individual, and communal establishment forms. But then we also had, for paper questionnaires, we had the household, the continuation form, if people had requested more forms, if there were more individuals in the house than the number of paper questionnaires that we'd sent them initially, and then also the individual forms as well. And for each of those, we had a Welsh variant, and we had a variant for England and Wales, and then within Wales itself, we had a Welsh form in English and we had a Welsh form in Welsh. So that then, for those three, took us to 9 different form types and 12 overall. And then there was also kind of the dummy data that was provided from returns that we got from field staff as well, all needing to be consolidated into a single model. And people will always find ways to break your system in a way that you haven't anticipated. So, for example, on the electronic questionnaires, by pressing the back button once they'd submitted a certain response, and those required new methods to counter that in the coding and convergence and checks on the data. So I think the initial processing pipeline model started off as about a dozen boxes, and it ended up being around 4.5 meters when printed out, which if we were doing this in person, I think we usually try to stick that on the wall as well, just to give a sense of how complicated the process was. And then within this as well, you've got the text coding side of it, of taking the unconstrained write-in text and coding that to agreed numerical classifications for ongoing downstream processing and analysis. And there are 3 types of those questions. So socio-cultural questions, so those could be ethnicity, religion, country of birth, national identity, main language, passports, employment questions, so occupation and industry, or sexual orientation and gender identity collected as experimental variables. I'm reading a note that I don't quite know what that means. Anyway, the coding tools are only as good as the lookups and indices that underpin them. So I think that having access to the data was extremely advantageous in identifying new and unexpected entries into the data. And we were able to set up governance processes for evaluating new entries, so new text write-ins that we were seeing in real time, and that vastly reduced the number of responses that were sent for clerical resolution and reduced the delays and associated costs, and also meant that there weren't any delays in the downstream processing as well. Again, from what I said about some of the unforeseen circumstances, so moving displaced students, the way that we processed allowed us the opportunity to be able to kind of deal with that as well. So during the pandemic, students were not at their term time address, which caused a potential issue there. So the guidelines that we offered was for that we provided were for students who were living at their out of term address, which should really be at term time address, to complete the short form at their out of term address, so whether that was their parents' house or whoever that might be, and then to request a census questionnaire for their term time address. Quite a complicated piece of guidance. And what we did then was we created a new method to identify students that should have been at their term time address, to ensure that they were counted there and were able to move them. Again, that was an advantage of doing this in-house, but also evidence as well of the types of complications that needed to be factored in when developing the processing pipeline. And then I'll just sort of briefly touch on resolving multiple responses. So there could be legitimate reasons why you might get multiple responses for a single household, but this has to be dealt with in processing. But you also have possible errors as well. And so having the modern technology that we had sort of provided us with advances in the way that we were able to do that resolving of multiple responses in terms of the statistical matching methodology, in terms of the data merge and retention methods that we included, and also as well to identify where we had potentially had these multiple responses and to deduplicate them. So again, quite a complex process that was assisted through the fact that we were using a digital first approach. So apologies that was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I will now stop talking and I will hand on to Pete Large to talk about data quality in an online first census.
Thanks, Rob. Morning, everyone. So I'm Pete Large. I've been I'm head of census statistical design at the moment, but I've spent the last few years working on the quality assurance of the census data. So what I'm going to do is just talk through some of the aspects of having an online first census that affected the work on the quality. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Rob. So I think Rob's talked quite a bit about some of the aspects of completing the questionnaire online. So there's a couple of reasons why it's really important for people to complete the census, and one of them, maybe the most obvious, is we want to get good quality estimates at the end of it. So one of the easiest ways to do that is to get a high response rate. And we got a high response rate not just by being online first, but by making both online and paper as accessible as possible and as easy to complete as possible. So that's partly about the completion instrument itself, but there's also being able to make more guidance immediately available to the user. So when they're trying to respond to a particular question, they can click on something and find out, the advice on how to complete ethnic group, what we mean by religion. And as well as having the guidance easily accessible, if needs be, it's also possible to change it very quickly as well. There's another aspect as well of being able to provide guidance bilingually at very little additional cost. So that's the actual data collection. I think Rob might have mentioned data validation that we can do through the online instrument. So, for example, if somebody when somebody put in their date of birth on the census, the online instrument will say, OK, just to check, you're 43, is that correct? And so we could improve the quality of some of the information collected there. We could also put limits on variables such as age, cars, bedrooms to make sure that people were submitting reliable data. And also, it was probably helpful to the user of some of the things we could do, for example, using names when we're referring to people within the household. So part of the census questionnaire was a relationship matrix where first person completes the form, they put their name in, and then the second person is asked, what's your relation to the first person on the form? And it's a little bit more accessible, a little bit more reliable if you could say, what's your relationship to Pete Large? If we go on to the next slide. So a little bit more about completing the questionnaire. So we had searches you type for some writing answers, such as country of birth. So that probably reduced respondent burden if you don't have to type out the whole of Democratic Republic of Congo. And hopefully it also improved the quality of some of those responses as well. You're less liable to make typing mistakes if you're selecting something from a drop-down menu. Rob also mentioned continuation forms. So if you have a paper questionnaire in Census 2021 that had space for 5 people in your household, and if your household was larger than 5 people, you were asked to contact ONS, we'd provide you with an additional form, and the additional people could be included on that form. So we recognise there's always a risk that somebody might get to the limit of their first form and they simply don't bother to request an additional form. So online responses avoid the problem of that. You could have households, theoretically, households as large as you want. So that was a minor improvement in quality, we think. Flushed responses, that's a bit of census jargon, I'm afraid. Normally on the online responses, you complete all the questions and then you're asked to click on the submit button, which formally sends the response to ONS. There were a number of households that completed all the questions, but they just didn't click submit at the end. So when we wanted to allow them the chance to go back and change their responses if they wanted to, even if they'd completed all the question. But at the end of the data collection period, if their response was still there, but they hadn't clicked submit, we could flush the response. We could basically force the submission down, so we didn't lose their data. And also, unlike paper questionnaires, having online completion means we can ensure that people answer certain questions. They simply can't submit it without answering some questions. So that means we had much lower imputation rates for those questions. So if we click on to the next slide, I'll just say a little bit more about that. So what we've got here is pretty much a random selection of census questions, and I've put the non-response rate for 2011 and 2021 there. So the non-response rate, that is, if we've got a census response back, what proportion of people didn't answer that particular question? And as you go down the list, my rule of thumb is, roughly speaking, question non-response rates were about half the level in 21 than they were in 2011. And a large part of that is attributable to the online collection. Now, there is one thing I want to pick up on here, not strictly related to online completion, but it is important. You might look, for example, at the bottom row of that and think, OK, 21, 1.4% non-response for Welsh language skills. Does that mean that the census is underestimating the proportion of people who can speak Welsh? It doesn't, because what we do, if there's a non-response to a question, we impute an answer. And to do that, we find somebody who's similar to the person who hasn't responded in the important characteristics, and we use them as a donor to impute the value of a particular variable that's been missed out. So the census data is the best estimate we can have of basically everybody who's usually resident in the country. Okay, if we click on to the next one, thanks, Rob. So we did a lot of work looking at the quality of responses. I mean, there's a lot of background research suggesting that online is higher quality, but it's important to remember that respondent error will always exist. We're trying to collect data from nearly 60 million people. And not only can people make mistakes answering the questions for themselves, they can certainly make mistakes when answering the questions on behalf of someone else, which is a major part of the census data. So respondent error, it's generally pretty low, but it does exist, and it does mean that online responses don't solve all the quality issues you can have in the data. It does mean no scanning errors, which I know Rob did allude to, and no delays in receiving the questionnaires once they've been submitted. Now, the next point is really important, so I'll say a few things about this. What we're trying to do with the census, what my team is focusing on, is getting really good quality estimates. Now, you're working with different online services, and it might be that you're not actually trying to provide statistics, you're just providing a service, or it might be that you're using an online collection to run a survey. But what we had to do was to make sure that, firstly, we were trying to get as high a response rate as possible, because that helps us get good quality estimates. And also we had to make sure that where people didn't respond to the census, and it's inevitable that not everybody would, that non-response didn't affect the quality of the estimates, or it affected the quality to a small degree as possible. So Rob showed a few charts looking at digital propensities and how likely people were to respond online or on paper as relative to the whole. And there are different response rates observable across the country. So again, Kensington and Chelsea was mentioned as a local authority with a relatively low response rate. There are many local authorities with response rates above 98%. But the census statistical design mitigates a lot of the problems that can come up with differential response rates. So we have very sophisticated logistic regression statistical models and other approaches using admin sources that mean even if we haven't captured everybody in an area, we can model not only the number of people that haven't been captured, but also their characteristics. So that and our models took into account the I would say the mode of response, the characteristics of the area, whether it was a paper first area or whether it was an online first area. So we're avoiding the risk that moving to an online first, having different modes of completion could affect the estimates for different areas. Multiple responses to the same person. Again, this has already been mentioned. It is a really important part of the overall estimation process. And you might think that having both online and paper completion so easily accessible could increase the risk that you have one person in a household saying, okay, I'm going to complete a paper form because my partner's not going to be bothered, and their partner thinking, I'm really going to surprise my wife because I'm going to order an online completion and I'm going to do it myself. So we did have very sophisticated methods again of making sure we resolved those. We could identify them and make sure that there wasn't any double counting. There is the risk of having double key presses, so we did some checks of that. So for example, people wanted to say they had one car or one bedroom and accidentally type in 11. There was some evidence of that, but not enough to make a difference to the usefulness of the statistics. And search as you type, I think I've mentioned already, we'd expect that to improve the quality of the some of the writing answers. And we did have a quick check just to make sure that there was no evidence of people just selecting the first thing in a list and coming up with unrealistic estimates, and we didn't find any evidence of that. Okay, thanks, Rob. So this slide is not so much about the quality of the data, but how we actually did the quality assurance. We did a huge amount of quality assurance on the census data. And we split it into two strands. There was one strand which was looking at the census processes themselves, and there was another strand which is what we called the validation of the estimates, which was looking at the final statistics and saying, are these plausible? So on the first of those, having both online and paper response routes, we did merge the data early, but before that point, those were two separate sets of processes that needed to be quality assured. So that was something we had to take account of when we planned the QA. A major advantage we had in 2021 compared to 2011 was that the online data was available to us pretty much as soon as it came in and from anywhere in the country. So in 2011, it had to go through a certain amount of processing before it was available to the QA team. And that meant, for example, I think it was Cornwall that was the first area that came through. So the QA team could look at Cornwall, and then maybe it could look at Wiltshire or Lancashire. But it was only at quite a late stage in the process they could look at the national figures. Whereas what we had this time was, even by census day, we had a very blurry picture of what was happening nationally, but that picture was just becoming a little bit clearer as the weeks went on, as the more data came through and the paper questionnaires came through. So that made quality assurance easier. That ties in with the idea of having more time available. And then the point about validating results. So I said that we had a slightly blurry picture very early on because we had the online data, but we were very conscious that the picture was going to change when we had the paper questionnaires available as well. And one of the most important differences there was we expected, and we were correct to expect, that paper responses were going to be biased towards older people. So you might come up with fairly early indicative estimates for a certain variable, and you think that's a bit lower than I expect. But once I've got all the paper questionnaires in, I expect this number to go up, and that's pretty much what I'd expect. So that was something that we needed to bear in mind when we're doing the quality assurance. So just to summarise, I've said there, Online First has scope for improving quality and timeliness of data. I've got no doubt that in 2021 census it did. That's not necessarily true for every data collection you might do, but it worked very well on the census. I've talked a little bit about the impact of different digital propensities. So again, on the census, we had very sophisticated statistical models to reflect that and to adjust it to make sure that we had the most reliable population estimates and estimates for every topic we could. But again, that might not be possible if you're running a different survey or providing a different service. And the quality assurance, in many ways, having Online First made quality assurance easier because we had the data earlier, but there were additional processes and additional complexity. So all of that was something we took into account when we were planning the quality assurance to make sure we got the work completed on time and it didn't delay the release of the estimates. So I've gone through that very quickly, Rob. You could have actually talked longer about some of your things.
I'll spare everyone that, Pete, and do it more directly.
Yeah. Yeah,
sorry,
fantastic.
Pete.
No worries at all. Thank you so much, Pete and Rob. So much to digest there. I certainly have learned lots. You think about the process and you think about the complexity of it and you think about the benefits, but then also you've alluded to some of the things that have come about because of those complexities in terms of extra processes. But it is that iterative approach and being able to tweak and change things as you go along that is the real benefit, isn't it? So lovely. I'm going to open it up to questions. We've got about 15 minutes. So if you've got any questions, do pop them in the chat now. I'm just going to have a quick look and see if there's any there at the minute. Nothing there at the minute. Please do pop them in. I've got a couple, and I will kick off with one. This could be potentially for both of you, but you talked quite a lot about the test in 2019 and really, what was the scale of that? How did that work? And if we talk about the iterative approach and kind of learning and then, putting some of those learnings into the real census run in 2021, what were the biggest learnings that you took through from the test in 2019 into 2021? And, what was the scale of that? How did it work?
Do you want me to kick off on that, Rob?
Yeah, if you want to go for it, Pete.
Yeah. Okay. So that was the census rehearsal, which it was a dry run of the census that we conducted in 4 local authorities. So 2 in London, Carlisle, and Ceredigion. So we tried to have a range of different local authorities and also to test the processes in Wales, of course. And it was sort of split into 2 rehearsals. There was the collection rehearsal, which was all the stuff that Rob was talking about of how we contact households, how we follow up non-response, etc., etc. And then a couple of months after that, we used the data we'd collected as part of the processing rehearsal. So that was all the behind the scenes stuff of how we get the data into a database and run certain statistical processes against it. And it was the latter. I'll just talk about quality assurance because that was the part I was involved in. The quality assurance rehearsal was part of the latter rehearsal. And I'll say the one specific thing I think we got from that was we had started off with a very ambitious picture of how we were going to do the quality assurance with using tools. Using one major tool that was a bit cutting edge. It was new to ONS, but it was going to do everything. And it was clear from that rehearsal that that was a very high-risk strategy. So we fell back to using something a little bit more modular, based on PySpark, which again has been mentioned, but we were very confident was going to do the job. So I suppose for me, the rehearsal was a way of making sure we were being pragmatic about what we were doing and not taking risks on unproven technology.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that in relation to the collection rehearsal of that, validating the approach and not necessarily taking risks. So I think what the 2019 census rehearsal, from my understanding, provided was the collection operation allowed us to tune the methods that we had in terms of field allocation and field priority, and also the paper and online approach that we took, and to validate that to an extent. So obviously gave us the opportunity to road test that model in advance. And it's difficult to unpack precisely why we got such positive response. Did we have a captive audience because of the pandemic? Was it because of the strategy that we took? Was it because of the kind of comms and promotion campaign? But all of it has kind of contributed in some way. And I think that test was kind of vital to reassuring that the collection methods that we were proposing were correct, and again also fine-tuning those. But I also say, like, another learning from that was one of the things was more what we didn't test as part of that rehearsal as well. So we tested with households, but we didn't test with communal establishments, and we had a few sort of teething issues to begin with that, and that probably took, I guess, kind of most of our time within the collection operation, optimizing as we were going for that. And I guess with hindsight, almost the absence of that test reinforced the importance of kind of testing and rehearsing in advance. So yeah, those would, I guess, be the two things from my perspective.
Great, thank you. Good to hear that it was the 4 local authorities in the spread as well. I didn't realise or know that. Please do pop your questions into the chat. Rob, I have a question on the digital propensity index. So you talked about, you know, are we being bold enough or brave enough in terms of the levels that we're setting? So if you think about the online share, paper was 67.6, online 92.6, with your kind of new model, a 25% difference. When was that piece of work done? Was that carried out after the census? And what will you do with that information, I suppose, for next time? Will it change how you develop your strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when was that done? So that was published, I think, trying to remember I think it was published at the around sort of the turn of the year. I can't remember precisely when. We developed that. We spent a few months, probably several months, developing that. And as I said, we tested out various independent variables to feed into the model, and then trained that on the online first area data that we had as well. So we were quite careful in developing that, and including the index of multiple deprivation. There's obviously one for Wales and there's one for England, so it was effectively kind of 2 models as well that we took the approach of producing. So yeah, that's been published, and the full report and the full estimates, projections for online share that we might have achieved are available, definitely to local authority level. That's, you can see that within the interactive maps on the publication itself. In terms of what we would do with that, I think the way that we envisaged it was, what was very helpful to us in our design was using the hard to count digital index. It was a good and relatively robust indicator that I guess was borne out by the what we observed in terms of the online share from Census, and that was developed, as I said, from external sources such as DVLA data or Ofcom data on the digital propensity to so it's effectively kind of creating our own version or kind of tuning our own version of that based upon having done such a large scale sort of data collection operation. So in terms of how that would be used internally, that I guess is dependent on some of the decisions that we make as far as the future of population statistics, and that's a little bit of a plug for the next session. But we've made that publicly available, and we've engaged with a few bodies as well on whether it's something that might be kind of useful for them in terms of planning digital services. And that's something that if anyone looks at and has any sort of questions on having done so, we'd be happy to kind of help and support on that.
Lovely. And thank you for plugging the next one. Sorry, Pete, come in ahead.
I think the results go down to the LSOA level, don't they, Rob?
They do. I was in the back of my mind, I was sort of umming and ahhing as to did we publish them, but I think we definitely did, didn't we?
Yeah. So when we published them, we were hoping that it was the sort of thing that any organisations looking to do local online services would find useful. Just to have a quick check of are there any areas here that might need particular attention for, not having the same levels of digital propensity.
That's great. Thank you, Pete. And Pete, I have a final question for you. Last call for questions if you've got any. If you think of any after the event, you can obviously send them through to the team here, and we'll make sure that we get a response as well. So Pete, my last question for you is around the non-response rate and the donors. Again, something new that I have learned. How does that work? Is it a pool of kind of people you call upon? Is it kind of profiling? How does it work?
Okay, so if we're talking about, let's say you submitted your census form, but you've missed out one question, and how do we decide what answer we're going to put in for you? Yeah. What we would do is to find somebody who is similar to you in relevant characteristics. And so those relevant characteristics will be different if you've not answered Welsh language to if you've not answered general health. So, for example, for Welsh language, I imagine relevant variables would include age, country of birth, well, main language would be an obvious one as well. So we pick somebody who is similar to you, who's geographically close to you, and we say, okay, any of the relevant variables we were going to take from this one person. So if, for example, you had missed both Welsh language skills and main language, we would copy that data across from the same person. So you've got the same underlying combination of variables. So the multivariate distributions are maintained. Now, we stress we can't guarantee by any means that we're correct for any individual, but what we're trying to do is to maintain the statistical distributions so the final estimates are as reliable as possible.
Gotcha. Super complex, but really good explanation. Thank you very much. Any final questions? I've got a couple around comms, but I'm going to keep them, and I'm going to invite somebody from your comms team to come to our Communicating Digital Community of Practice in terms of what comms methods might have worked really well and where you might have seen a spike. I know Sarah in the last webinar talked about the census been referenced on EastEnders, and again, the benefit of using a digital product, you could see in real time the spike in returns after that. So I'll keep that for the comms community of practice. Lovely. I just want to say a big thank you to Rob and to Pete. The amount of time and effort that goes into preparing for these types of webinars can't be underestimated. So diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you so much both. As I said at the start, we are going to do a little bit of real-time testing and feedback, if that's okay with you. So Alau has put into the chat the link to Menti, so it's menti.com, and the code is 38063864. So if you could take a second, pop in that into a browser and pop in that code, and I will run through the 3 or 4 questions that we have. While you're doing that, a reminder that the final session in this series will be Thursday week, so Thursday the 11th, and again it'll be 9:30 to 11 o'clock. And we're going to be talking about almost kind of what next, how the data from the census is brought to life, and then what will happen next. And I'm sure the team don't have all the answers, so it'll be really interesting to hear where their thinking is at this stage. Okay, so let's go through the questions then. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So how much do you agree or disagree with the following statements? And it's strongly agree, strongly disagree. The webinar made sense to me. I learned something new today. I'd like to learn more about how ONS approached the Census 2021. If you just answer those, your answers will be anonymous, so they're not going to appear on screen here. These are just screen grabs. Lovely, so hopefully you'd have had an opportunity to do that. I'm looking to allow or at least see if responses are coming in to move on to the next one. So the next question then is, how did you find the session? Are there any tools or resources you would find useful? So an open opportunity here for you to pop in your thoughts. How did you find the session? Are there any tools or resources that you would like us to follow up with? I'll give you a couple of seconds to type that in. And this Mentimeter will be open post-webinar, so if you want, you can go back in and add any thoughts that you might think of. Okay, the second last question then, what else would you like to know about Census 2021? As I said, the recording from the first webinar will be available to you. We have the third in the series on the 11th. So if there's anything else that you would like us to cover as part of this partnership, we can ensure that that's included in the planning for the 11th. So what else would you like to know? And bear in mind, you will be getting the presentation with all the links, so there'll be a bit of self-directed research there as well. And then finally, any further comments? So this is just an opportunity for you to pop anything else, but this could be something about this webinar, it could be something about sessions or topics you'd like to see in future webinars. It could be anything, process. It could be a question that you have for the team that we haven't had an opportunity to put to them. Lovely. So I'm going to give 5 minutes back. Everybody be glad to hear. So Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you so much for everybody who attended. And as I said again to Rob and Pete and to the team behind the scenes, to Elise, Alau and Llynas, diolch yn fawr. I hope we'll see you all on the 11th. And in the meantime, we will send out an email with the links to the recordings for the presentation. So diolch, have a great rest of your day and thank you very much.